My name is Lisa Schultz, and I'm the co-director of the Terrence J. Murphy Institute for Catholic Thought, Law, and Public Policy, along with my co-director, Billy Junker from the Center for Catholic Studies. We want to welcome you to another series, another installment in our Hot Topics Cool Talk series. This one is an especial pleasure for me, not only because of the topic, but because of the way that it displays the brilliance of this university. Our speakers include Professor from the Opus College of Business and 2 alumni of the School of Law. And I'm so proud to see what they're doing now and how they're shaping the world. Our moderator for today is one of our alums from the class of 2007, John Kantke. He is currently working on 2 projects that are supported by federal grants, 2 projects from the Volunteers of America. He's an attorney at the Estate and Elder Law Services in Northeast Minneapolis, and staff attorney for Center for Excellence in Supported Decision Making. He also, just starting this next semester, will be teaching for us and teaching the Elder Law and Guardianship Alternatives program. So I'm going to turn it right over to John to start our introductions.
It's a pleasure to be here, and one of the things I miss most about law school are these civil debates that we have here, and it's a great opportunity. So it's great to see so many students here, but also community members as well. The issue of Medicaid is an interesting one. My focus in my practice is with seniors, and I do a lot of Medicaid work with long-term care. But in Minnesota, the Medicaid spending is actually quite diverse, and I just want to paint a brief picture here. On a population percentage, the greatest number of people in Minnesota that receive Medicaid are families with children. Also included in that population are adults with disabilities, and then the population I deal with, senior citizens as well, particularly with long-term care costs. The spending is different, though. Even though families with children make up the largest percentage of our population in Minnesota receiving Medicaid, they do not receive the biggest percentage of the dollars. The biggest percentage of the dollars actually go to adults with disabilities. So it's not a senior issue necessarily, it's not a disability issue necessarily, it's not a families with children issue only necessarily, it's all of those things combined when you put together the population percentages and where the dollars are going. So today, the speakers here, as Lisa, Professor Schultz said earlier, we're very honored to have on his way in. Lucas Swanepoel is the Senior Director, Government Affairs at Catholic Charities USA, and prior to joining Catholic Charities USA, he served as the Associate Director for Governmental Relations for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, where he was responsible for government relation efforts on issues related to domestic and international social justice, Catholic education, and communications. Lucas also worked for 8 years as the legal attaché for the Holy See Mission to the United Nations in New York, and is a founding board member for the Waterfront Legal Clinic in Jersey City, New Jersey. Lucas received his Juris Doctorate from the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota, and his bachelor's in History and Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. And then starting us off today will be Dave Vang. Dave is seated to my left at the table. He graduated summa cum laude from the University of St. Cloud State and received a PhD in economics from Iowa State University. And besides being an award-winning teacher, he has performed more than 90 consulting assignments for firms ranging from small businesses to Fortune 100 corporations. He also served as CFO for a technology firm through the process of startup all the way through going public, and this experience led him to co-author the textbook Entrepreneurial Financial Management, an Applied Approach, 3rd edition, published by M.E. Sharp. And with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Vang. Thank you very much.
Well, hearing the credentials of my colleague here, I feel like the world is a tuxedo and I'm a pair of brown shoes. My name is Dave Vang. As mentioned, I'm a professor here at the University of St. Thomas. This is my 30th year. I started when I was 9 years old. And I should get something out of the way. I'm one of those guys who's never worked a day in his life. I just absolutely what it is. I love what I do for a living, and I hope you guys all find that. A lot of it has to do with the fact that I wanted to work here at the University of St. Thomas, so that's actually happened for me. So I wish all of you the best on that. A little bit about myself, real briefly. I'm a Minnesota boy. I come from a little town called Deerwood, which is about 140 miles straight north of here. And I'm the youngest of 5. My mom and dad had 8th grade educations. And when I was 6 years old, my dad wasn't doing very well, and his health started to really deteriorate. And then in March of 1967, one day, he really was having all kinds of trouble, couldn't breathe and things like this. And so my mom got to the point where my mom called to have him taken to the hospital by the ambulance service. Now, if you go to where I'm from, in the hospital, they have a nice little plaque about the history of the medical system there. And they kind of brag about having a full-service ambulance service in 1966, the year before. And the full-service ambulance service consisted of a guy who had a local gas station up there who owned a second-hand ambulance. And so when my mom called, and if you're not familiar, well, all you guys are so young, you probably don't realize this, but in the 1960s, if you went to get gas at your gas station, you didn't have to leave your car. Someone pumped it for you, they made change for you, they washed your windows, checked your air, all this kind of stuff. Well, this guy, his helper didn't come in that day, so he couldn't answer the call and couldn't come out until he got finished with the customer. So he drove out to our farm, and it turned out my dad was in such tough shape that it wasn't going to be the usual pick up the ambulance, taxi him to the hospital kind of thing. He had to work on him, and he was all by himself. So the person who drove the ambulance was my oldest brother, who was all of 17 years old. He later went on to become a successful race car driver as a hobby. But anyway, this full-service ambulance service didn't fill up the oxygen tanks between one of the runs. And so while my brother was driving to the hospital 8 miles away, my father died. Okay. Fast forward 10 years later, I'm the youngest, so I'm the last one at home at this point in time. I get a phone call at school saying, you know, come out of class, talk to the central administration. And I find out my mother had a heart attack. And it laid her out so bad that she couldn't work, but she was a few years too young to apply for Social Security benefits or things like this. And so this was the other hot topics thing, and I mentioned the statute of limitations ran out. I eventually got a job where I broke 5 laws every time I got out of bed, including the minimum wage law and being paid in cash and all this kind of stuff. But I was my mom's primary caregiver for the next couple of years. And we didn't have health insurance because having the heart attack was a pre-existing condition. And so it took about 4 years before she was able to get surgery. So we went without health insurance during that time period. Now, the point I'm going to this is not because I like sharing all kinds of stuff about myself. It's because everything about healthcare is something that affects all of us. We all have stories kind of like this. You mentioned something like the Medicare donut hole. Well, that's probably impacted maybe some people or someone we know in this room. The reimbursement rates for Medicare. We probably might have older fathers and mothers who might not be able to keep their doctor because of the reimbursement rates and the doctor, so on and so forth. So everything about healthcare touches us one way or another. So it's not just an academic exercise. So I just want to make sure about that. So this is being a Catholic institution, and I'm kind of going back to my catechism a little bit. If I'm incorrect, if there's any priests or theologians, please correct me if I have this wrong. But kind of a way to kind of visualize, you know, how to look at issues like this and why we'd have a session like this. One thing I'd say is in the Catholic intellectual tradition, intentions are very important, but they're not a get-out-of-jail card kind of thing. So, for instance, I have sort of this little flow chart of ethics, if you will. If I want to do something good for someone in this audience, I have good intentions, and I do the act, and it works out well for you, okay, obviously that's not a sin. I wanted to do something good, a good outcome happened, obviously everything's fine. If I have malice in my heart towards someone here, like, you know, the photographer, I really hate you. Yeah, I do. I'm going to try to do something that hurts you, and I succeed. I do whatever happened is bad. Obviously, that is a sin. But what about the other side? Let's say I have really bad intentions. I really, really hate the photographer. I do something, but I'm not very good at this evil genius stuff, and it whole backfires on me. And I set in motion some events that cause him to win the lottery, and he never has to work the day of life again because, you know, a good outcome happened. Catholic Church would still say, well, that's still a sin. I mean, even though it was a good outcome that happened, I had bad intentions when I did it. But the final case, what if I have good intentions and there's a bad outcome? Well, then, this is kind of a quick little thing. You know, did I do PTA? Did I pray, think, act? With act being at the end. In other words, you don't take an action and think, well, this is morally the right thing to do. Now I'm going to pray everything works out. No, we should be analyzing, investigating, have an informed conscience before we act. And that's really the session that this is all about here, is when we're talking about healthcare, looking at it from the different sides, and being informed about everything before we actually make a decision, rather than just doing on our feelings or our emotions. So in the part of being informed and having an informed conscience about this, I hope I don't insult anyone's intelligence, but I'm kind of starting from the beginning about some of the terminology. Healthcare and health insurance are not the same thing. So we've got to make sure that when we're doing policy prescriptions, that we don't think we have something solved when we're actually, missing the other side of the equation here. So healthcare and healthcare delivery and healthcare insurance are not the same thing. And two kind of counterexamples of this. You may have remembered a few years ago, there was a couple of stories in the news about a malpractice insurance got so high that various doctors who stopped delivering babies in certain counties. And so women who had health insurance like Blue Cross Blue Shield and so forth actually had to drive quite a ways to get the prenatal care and the delivery and so forth. So that's an example where, in theory, there was insurance, there was Blue Cross Blue Shield, all this kind of stuff, but there wasn't the healthcare delivery available in that particular county. The exact opposite is what's happening in the laser eye care or laser eye surgery situation. That's an industry that seems to have kind of been created without health insurance. And almost all of it is paid private. I think there might be a few plans or a few situations where an insurance company will pay for it, but most of it is private. So we have health care delivery of that particular type of situation, but not necessarily health insurance very broadly. So there are two different things, and so we've got to make sure that we don't think, hey, we solved the problem. Maybe we didn't, because maybe we're working on just half the equation, not both sides of the equation. More terminology. We've got to be careful to understand that insurance is not the same thing as welfare. Insurance is a policy or a strategy to help us hedge risk. And what is risk? Well, economists and statisticians in the 1800s kind of came up with a definition that mathematically works out to standard deviation, all this other kind of stuff, which is risk is having something other than expected happen. If I know for a fact something bad is happening or has happened, that's not risk. Risk is having something that we don't expect happen. So, for instance, you take a pool of 100 people, we might find out over time that maybe 2 out of these 100 people will have some sort of cancer. If we have an insurance policy, everybody pays for it, but we don't know which one of us is going to get this cancer. We all pay into it, but one of us gets cancer, that's unexpected for them, but we can deal with it as I said, an insurance type of situation. If you're going to have welfare, on the other hand, if you're going to actually help someone who's in need, probably the most transparent way to do it is actually go ahead and impose a tax or some sort of fee on people of higher income to pay for the disadvantaged in that particular situation, so that it can be above board, transparent, and so forth. So when we try to mix health insurance and welfare together, we might get some distorted results. For instance, if we have extra wide community standards, defining out who's going to be in the pool and so forth, you might wind up with the situation that I mentioned here in this middle bullet point, where you have the young, healthy people subsidizing the old. Well, this is almost the exact opposite of what welfare used to be, which was higher income people helping the lower income people. Here we might have low income young people subsidizing higher income older people. Pre-existing condition coverage, requiring that. Again, that's not risk. We know exactly that this person has this situation. If we accept them anyway, and we include them in the pool we have this situation of healthy people subsidizing known unhealthy people, or people who have already a pre-existing condition. When you start mixing things together, things get a little bit complicated and you get some distorted results because, again, insurance, when you get right down to it, is still sort of a voluntary activity. If the insurance companies have to set up a fee ahead of time, we're all going to act in our own self-interest. If it's a good deal for us, we'll buy that policy. If it's not a good deal, we won't. Well, obviously, it's going to be a good deal for people who have pre-existing conditions, and then you have this situation that economists like to call the adverse selection, that the people who are going to get the most out of this personally are going to be most likely the people who sign up. The people who are going to get least out of this arrangement are going to be least likely, but we need both of them, or at least more healthy people, to help subsidize the costs of it. So when we start mixing together, as I said, welfare type activities and insurance, we get some strange distortions, and that's where we hear things about the death spiral, that each year we have to raise rates because too many people of the pre-existing conditions signed up for a policy and not enough of the people who don't have it and so forth. So when it comes to a healthcare system, 3 things we're looking for: quality, affordability, and universal coverage. pick one. You really can't have all of them. If there was a silver bullet like that, we wouldn't be here talking about anything. This is what we have to, this is the priorities. We have to say which of these are going to be the priorities. And I wouldn't go so far to say that there's any moral righteousness for necessarily any one of these. We just got to be aware that that's what we're doing. We're making a choice among these three priorities. Which one are we having as a priority? And I'm very excited for the next presentation coming up because he has lots more inside information, more examples, and so forth. But I'm just going to give one example of that's sometimes brought up is Cuba. They have universal coverage. And I had the privilege of spending some time with an individual who escaped from communist Cuba and went on to have a very successful life here financially. And he was telling me that, Cuba has a lot of hospitals. These are buildings called hospitals. But he says when his relatives get sick, he says they call him. And basically when they go to the hospital, they have to supply their own bed sheets and things like this. Then they get a word to him, and then he figures out some way to get the medicines needed smuggled into the country to pay for the care or to do the treatment. I also have another wonderful opportunity to become friends with a priest who is running the Archdiocese ministry down in Venezuela. Cuba has many more doctors per capita than everybody else, and they actually export them as a form of getting hard currency. So they actually would send, lend some of their doctors to Venezuela and so forth to provide medical care and so forth. But what they're calling a doctor is someone who's more in the mid-level of training of a nurse in this country. And I don't mean that in any sort of derogatory way. As a matter of fact, I'm actually envious of this, is that the typical American nurse could probably handle, if she had the authority to give prescriptions and things like this, could probably handle 80% or maybe even more of all the maladies that come into a clinic. And so that's how Cuba is doing. It's like we're creating doctors, quote unquote, but they're people who are not necessarily as trained as the doctors we have. We just give them the authority to do the treatment. And so basically saying, yes, we have universal coverage. It's cheap because, well, we don't provide our own bed sheet. You don't provide your own bed sheets and so forth. And we have a system designed to maybe cover 3/4 or more of the kind of maladies that come, but we're not going to necessarily be able to provide chemotherapy and all these other kind of things for the really super high need things in innocent, but we have universal coverage. So again, quality, affordability, universal care, which of these are going to be your priority? Okay. So getting to the issue of block grants, and I have a sense I might be the minority position here, why I'm kind of in favor of it. It's because the theory of block grants. Why they exist, or why this concept exists, is because the federal government can print its own money. It can take out almost an unlimited amount of debt to subsidize things. States can't. And so that's really, it's a political aspect of if we can shift the Medicare and Medicaid spending down to the lowest level, to the government units that can't print money, that can't issue debt, then we, in theory, should have more transparency. So if it's not enough money was given, if the block grant is not big enough to some particular state, then it becomes obvious, and then we make a conscious decision to ask for more. It's not blended into the health care plans, as I said, mixing together health insurance and welfare together and trying to pretend that it's not one or the other. Instead, we're making it very clear. This is the exact amount of money that we actually need. So what was given maybe not have been enough for the state, but now at least we now have a bench line and we know exactly how much to ask for and make a conscious decision about it. Third, I guess I'd say this would be somewhat consistent with the Catholic intellectual tradition of subsidiarity. Decisions really should be made by the lowest level units, the people closest to the situation. So if we do block grant down to the states, they would have more control over where the specific needs are. In various states, the demographics are very different, so they have different needs or priorities. As I said, we're getting this kind of out in the open. And of course, that subsidiarity is kind of consistent with this whole idea of, well, more flexibility. Let every state have more of its own control of how to do it, set its own priorities. As I said, rather than have a system that's not transparent in terms of, well, actually we were melding health or welfare into our health care policies or health insurance things, and now we have to subsidize them because it's not enough. So I said, let's get it out in the open and be very clear about this. So again, I'm talking mostly from the theoretical side of this. So I guess why I would be somewhat more in favor of the block grant approach to things. Well, this line's kind of scary. America is the brokest country in the history of the world. We have $20 million worth of actual debt, and the way the United States government does its accounting, we have sort of a pay-as-you-go year by year. We know that there's maybe 2 to 3 times that amount that we're going to have to pay in the future for various other entitlements for my particular generation. If you want to think about baby boomers, imagine a python that swallowed a really, really huge pig. And you can kind of see this lump as it works its way through so in other words, the baby boom generation happened. Well, right after World War II, geez, we've got to build a whole bunch of elementary schools. Oh, they're getting into high school. We've got to build, oh, we've got to provide jobs for this and so forth. Well, guess what? Now we're retirement age, and we're going to need more healthcare services. So it's a predictable result, as I said, but our accounting system at the federal level does not allow us to record the fact that we have these liabilities on our books right now, even though we know they're coming. So we have a huge amount of entitlement spending that has to happen in the future. And so we kind of have to make, I think we have to kind of make some actions now to make clear of what we're spending, that we're not fooling ourselves into thinking that we're not going to have these various expenses. I forgot the citation for this, but someone had the line, that which cannot go on forever won't. So, as I put here some final Catholic stuff, I would think block grants would be consistent with this Catholic concept of the community of saints. The community of saints consists of those who've gone before us, those who are with us now, and those who will be with us in the future. The people who are going to be paying the bill farther down the road don't exist, or they're too young. They don't have a voice right now. So when we make healthcare policy decisions, we can't just always be based on the here and now and how to help the people now. We have to realize if we're running deficits to make it happen, we're kicking the bill down to our grandchildren or our great-grandchildren. We have to be aware that that's consciously what we're doing and take that into account in the affordability issue of those 3 choices that we make. Kind of scary is that the United States, like many other countries, we're starting to get to an inverted family tree. You're familiar with the concept of the family tree. You have, grandma and grandpa have a bunch of kids. Each of those kids have a bunch of kids and so forth. So it's the family tree looks like a tree. What's happening now is you have 4 grandparents and 1 grandkid. And so if we're all running deficits now to get health care or other entitlements, we're kicking it down to a smaller number of saints, if you will, in the future to pick up the tab. So again, it's not either or or anything like that. We have to be aware this is consciously what we're doing when we make policies and so forth. That it's not just, what we're doing today is not just affecting the people today, it's going to be paid for probably by people in the future. So again, pick one. What's your priority? Is it quality of care? Is it affordability? Or are you trying to get universal coverage? You might be able to get 2, but at best you maybe can have 1, and so we have to make a conscious decision about that. Did I do okay, time? Thank you. Thank you very much.
Ready to start? All right. Well, I had to run back to my hotel room, and as they always remind you, it's good that Jesus saves. Same thing, do that with your PowerPoints. Save them on the right stick. All right. So what I'm going to do today is kind of go a little bit through the block grant discussion, what's happening on block granting as an idea, the pros and cons of it, some of the kind of advantage of it. I think Professor Vang kind of talked about, like, if we're honest about a lot of these things, when you watch TV, when you watch the political discussions, it's all yay or all nay, all great, all horrible. There's really not much middle ground, which I think really impacts our ability to make political kind of decision making. So I grew up in Wisconsin. I grew up on a dairy farm there, like Professor Vang, a town of 1,000 people. I was first generation college graduate. So many of the same advantages you see and some of the challenges you see of being somebody coming through being lower income to what you see. Now I live in Washington, D.C. I lived in New York City for a long time. And just the diversity of what the experiences are, both in healthcare, but also in poverty and access to opportunity in general. So I know Professor Vang talked a little bit about the block grant structure. What I want to do is talk about funding structures, and this is really unexciting, but it's key to understanding the block grant idea. So as Professor Vang talked about, the idea of block grant is to basically take a large sum of federal money, not put a whole lot of kind of strings on it, there's the word I was looking for, strings on it, and send it to the state so they can kind of decide how they want to do it in a very broad way. Now there's other ways that the federal government funds programs. The other is what we call as categorical grants. And that's where Medicaid falls in currently. That's also where Head Start falls in. That's where Title I falls in. Title I is your education programming for high school and college eds. And in those programs, you have the federal government saying, again, states, we're going to give you a pile of money for this particular purpose. And the strings and limitations are far more stringent as to what is expected of the state to do. In addition, the state is required to kick in some money to actually kind of share the burden on these issues. So when we talk about moving to block grants, we're really talking about that idea of moving from categorical grants to this more kind of strings free and open kind of idea. And what I'll do is first go through the kind of Medicaid ideas, why the categorical grant system actually works better for delivering of services, for delivering of quality, but also delivering of cost. And then the second point is to why block grants, when you change the system, as you saw during the current healthcare debate in Washington, D.C., why you lose a lot of the advantages that the current categorical system provides. So the funding mechanism for Medicaid is you have to be eligible. So it's an entitlement. So if you meet the poverty threshold requirements set by the federal government, you're automatically, or you're disabled, or you're senior. There's a number of other eligibility requirements. If you meet the eligibility, you're automatically eligible for Medicaid. And this is where, and Professor Bacon talked about this, the unlimitability of funds. And when we talk about federal entitlements, you often hear that term, federal entitlements. That's why Medicaid is considered an entitlement, is because it's a matter of law. If they meet the requirements of being eligible for the program, they get access to Medicaid, regardless of whether the federal government has appropriated it for that year or not. So if they didn't appropriate for it, too bad. It's still going to go on, largely in the form of deficit spending. The federal role, as I said, the federal role matches the programs without a limit. So again, regardless of what the federal government says, there's not going to be a limit on the amount, even if they run out of funds. And then the formula, state and federal government cost share. So the feds share about 50% to a high of 74%, depending on the state. Again, prioritizing those states with a higher level of poverty, higher level of need, higher level of people eligible for the program. So it isn't so stringent as that you just throw a block of money and it's stuck. You actually can accumulate this formula based on the needs of the state. And then feds pay about 6% of Medicaid costs, and states pay about 40% overall. So what I'm going to do is kind of go through a few kind of options of Catholic social teaching. Well, I think in many ways the current structural system, while it still needs improvement, I think there's many ways we can improve the current Medicaid program. Actually provides a better response to the poor and some of the priorities of Catholic social teaching than a fully block grant proposal would. So as we know, as for Catholic social teaching, we have a preferential option for the poor. Pope Francis often talks about the right to health care, that it is not just a consumer good, that everybody has a right to have access to health care. And what have we seen in Minnesota when it comes to Medicaid? Well, 1 in 3 children have access to a doctor because of Medicaid, particularly the Medicaid expansion. 26% of disabled individuals get access to health care through Medicaid. 15% of seniors get access to Medicaid through this program. And 44% of all births just in the state of Minnesota are covered by Medicaid. So when you think about the people we're serving, when you have to be poor, you have to be low income to even get eligible for the program, you see the need that exists out there. This is the number of people that are eligible for these programs, and it seems dramatically high, and this is in Minnesota. You guys are like the shining example on the hill of great states, of all the great things as far as access to services and programs and affordability. But even in the state of Minnesota, we're still seeing large demand for Medicaid. A large number of people who are low income still need access to treatment. And actually the life statement, actually across the country, it's about 50% of births. So when we talk about the need to protect life, I mean, one of that is the importance of Medicaid to allow individuals who are low income to have a child and not be saddled with debt for the rest of their life. I mean, one of the largest drivers of debt in the country is medical debt. So when you go into a hospital, you don't have access to insurance, you don't have Medicaid, you are saddled with a debt that impacts everything you do from there going forward. Again, and to the question of cost, the issue of efficiency. Medicaid is efficient. Again, in Minnesota, across the state, it costs less than private insurance does on a per individual basis. The administrative costs are far lower. Obviously, when you talk about economies of scale, I mean, any economist can explain that better than me. The advantages of economies of scale, you do it lower administrative costs, and Medicaid sees that reality as far as its delivery of services. And the cost of Medicaid over time has grown more slowly than private insurance has over the last 10 years. So as it all, it's it lifts people out of poverty, it addresses people who are planning to give birth, and it really does, I think in many ways, prioritize the poor as really at the individual level of access to services. So now the next step, so we talk about the individual, but now we talk about the broader solidarity. Solidarity between people and amongst communities. So obviously solidarity, and Professor Venk talked about it, is a fundamental principle of Catholic social teaching which recognizes the responsibility that we should have decisions to be made at the lowest possible level. And I think it's important to remember when we talk about solidarity, it's not only at the lowest possible level, but also that the higher levels of both structures and government and society have a responsibility to help those institutions at the local level if they are unable to afford to do it themselves. So it's a both and. It's not just only local, but it's also the need for the people at the higher levels to also respond to these realities. So what do we see across the country? We talk about poverty. Again, so we're talking about the United States working together as a collective. We see, again, Minnesota, the shining example, one of the lowest levels of poverty in the country. Congrats, Minnesota. But we see the higher levels of poverty, particularly in the southeast area, and where you're looking at 18% or more of people living in poverty in some of these places. So we know that poverty is a demand in particular regions. But now let's look at the Medicaid cost sharing. Where are we looking at most spending happening on Medicaid? Where are the money going? Well, despite those big numbers you saw in Minnesota, not that much is going to Minnesota. Most of the money, again, is going to the states with higher levels of poverty, which, of course, reflects the requirement of the formula grant. And this is where I think really gets into the issue of the solidarity that we need to have in a healthcare system. The idea that high-income states, the high-income individuals, the high opportunity places really do help support those places that have long-term cost challenges. So here is a great map I always love. They do this yearly on the who are the donor states and who are the debtor states. And basically, it's a look at looking at income taxes in that particular state, how much money goes to the federal government, and how much that state receives back in all federal programs. So military programs, roads, highways, Medicaid, everything. And you'll see there that actually Minnesota, at less than 75 cents, for every dollar that Minnesota taxpayers put into the federal government, they're only getting 75 cents back. So you are classified as a donor state. So you actually put in more to the federal revenue than you get back. Whereas a number of the other states, again, you're looking at over $2 in returned revenue from the federal government than their taxpayers put in. And I think this is the issue of solidarity that we need to talk about in the sense of it is those places like New York and California where there is a higher opportunity, there's a higher number of high-income individuals that pay a greater amount into the federal government system. They're actually not receiving as much back as they pay in, but they're helping to support those places where there's a long-term history of poverty, long-term lack of access to Medicaid. And I think that is the solidarity we need to recognize when we talk about federal income, federal taxes, and the role of how financing is done. So I think overall, the current formula system promotes national solidarity. It does promote the places where greater opportunity do help support those places that need greater opportunity. And the next point, Medicaid promotes subsidiarity. So this idea that at the local level, decisions are being made. Well, Medicaid isn't, you never believe this if you listen to the news, but there are waivers. There are state waivers. One of the things the states have to do is actually put in a number of waiver requirements as to say, look, in our local community, yes, that's great and wonderful, it doesn't quite work here. Here are the various types of waivers that we want to do, and this is just some of them, there's more, but, and including some of the Affordable Care Act waivers that tie into the Medicaid provisions. So there are opportunities to craft the program. It isn't the monstrosity of you must do everything this way. Now there are limits to how that's done, but there are opportunities to do waivers that the federal government can then approve or not approve or negotiate usually as to what those things look like. And again, even now what we see, that flexibility is taking shape in a number of states as they try different things. On one hand, you have more what you traditionally call liberal states trying to push for the Medicaid for all formula, using the waivers that exist in the law, pushing for greater flexibility. And then you have states who say we need more accountability in the system, pushing for greater work requirements on the system. So there are opportunities to have this kind of localism and local control as to how we provide access to Medicaid. And so now going on to block grants, and really I'm going to focus just particularly on some of the proposals that we've seen in the last year as to why what you saw that it helps to address the poor, it does provide access to subsidiarity, it does promote greater national Solidarity, and it provides access to health care for a heck of a lot of people, both in Minnesota and across the country. So here are some of the statistics from the various bills that have come out, and now, just for a kind of full disclosure, there's about 1 million of these ideas that have come out in the last 6 months, and they continue to come out every single day. Friday, there was another example of the government trying to do another version of the ACA repeal. But just to give you a sense of what the CBO found when they put out the bill that the Senate voted on, and they found that under the CBO, under the current, based on current law, compared to what was being proposed in the healthcare repeal bill, that we'd have 49 million more uninsured individuals. And I think one of the things that gets lost in that is that a large percentage of that coverage issue are the people in the Medicaid camp. I think most of the conversation often politically is on the issue of access to the insurance, access to the exchanges. And the Affordable Care Act created these exchanges, created this kind of new marketplace, but it also expanded the opportunity for states to expand Medicaid in their states. Now, not every state did, some didn't. But for some reason, as part of the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, not only have they sought to repeal the Affordable Care Act, but also fundamentally change not only the Medicaid expansion, but also all Medicaid for all people. And that is where, when they talked about the numbers of uninsured and the cost savings, much of it comes from fundamentally restructuring the Medicaid program from a entitlement program that you see now with the formula grants to states to a capped formula program. So basically, it would cap how much the federal government puts in on an annual basis, give it to the states, and the states have to make up the difference. So what does that do when you cap a program and you give it to the states? Well, it shifts risk. Ultimately, it shifts the risk from, as Professor Vang talked about, the entity that's able to print money and carry a large amount of debt, to the entities that 45 states are not allowed to carry any deficit, to have it as part of their constitutional requirements. So you're shifting this cost risk and future cost expansion to the state level. And if it goes up a lot in that state, or there's an emergency in that state, if there's a disaster in that state, the federal government is set as to how much they're on the hook, and any additional cost in insurance, the state's going to have to make up the difference. So what does that do? It shifts the risk from the federal government, from the federal deficit, to states, and through that shifting of risk, you get a dramatic kind of decrease in likely people being covered by the Medicaid, but also the funding available to states. And I give a good example of this. If you would say, well, how do we know this? Well, look at Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has a per capita capped Medicaid system, which caps the federal entitlement to Medicaid in Puerto Rico at around 20%, I think the number is. Whereas, as you know, as I just said, most of the states get about 50%. So one of the great structural aspects of Puerto Rico's long-term debt is the fact that they get about 30% less on Medicaid. And despite the fact their economy is dramatically decreasing, there is no opportunity for new funds. So when there was this last disaster supplemental to help the recovery of Puerto Rico, one of the things that didn't get a lot of news was a large new insert of money to Puerto Rico to kind of make up the difference in lack of funding. But it's a big driver in their deficit right now, why they're in bankruptcy control. And now to the issue of flexibility, and this really we have to be recognized. There's a real tension between flexibility and accountability. On one side, you want greater flexibility at the state level, but at the same time, we want accountability as to what they're going to deliver. We want popular provisions like access to health care for 26-year-olds. You want to make sure that you can't kick people off for pre-existing conditions. Well, those are all issues of accountability, but at the local level, they might want the flexibility to not have to do that. And this gives you kind of a little sense of what the bills did as far as that kind of flexibility and providing new waiver requirements as to requiring services, requiring particular types of services, and access to drugs. And this is the final slide, and this is what I had an epiphany this morning. Again, to say we've seen this show before, we've done this before, we've done from an entitlement to a block grant before, and the great example is TANF. So TANF, for those of you who are really well plugged in, young folks in the mid-90s, so it was a big exchange of welfare programs as part of the welfare reform efforts by President Clinton, which took the TANF program, which is an entitlement, a cash entitlement program, and made it into a block grant. Since then, what have we seen? Exactly what we predict on healthcare. We have seen TANF assets being frozen at the federal level. States have lost more than a third of its value, and now we have inequality as to who gets access to the money versus who doesn't. And states using that flexibility to use much of the TANF money they get from the federal government to do things that have nothing to do with actual access to poverty programs. So they're building things like roads, and they're building things to help fill their budget holes that they have at the state level in order to make up for the lack of funding. So we've seen this show before. We've seen a lot of the kind of the same ideas and arguments, and I think we have some lessons that we can learn from other programs.
Okay. Per the format, Professor Vang, you have 5 minutes to respond to Mr. Swanepoel if you so choose to.
I think he did a fantastic job. Seriously, so fast we get to questions.
Yeah.
Okay. I have several questions, a lot of themes. One of the themes is your pick one of three is causing quite the consternation among our people in the audience here, saying, why? Why do we have to pick three? And aren't there examples of other countries where they have more than one, where they have two, or they have three, with Sweden, Germany, France being thrown out as possible options? Are you able to respond at all to, other than Cuba, more positive examples of countries trying to do more than one of your three items?
Well, I guess I'm being too harsh to say one. It's you got to set your priorities.
Yes, I know. Yeah.
You have to set priorities. Which of those three are going to have as your priority? And so, yeah, there are countries that are trying to do two, but one thing that is not taken into account is over the long term. So, yeah, Sweden, Canada's been relatively successful, at least for the time being, but we're seeing some issues there. A lot of these countries, I think, they're making a compromise on the quality. This is why you sometimes see a lot of people doing.
They have better results, though. They have actually better.
Well, I disagree with that. Okay, one reason someone mentioned, that they have better results and so forth. One thing I kind of disagree with that is, as I said, well, first, to use the gate analogy, if you put a gate on a country, are more people trying to get in for what you have than trying to leave for what you have. You have a lot of people coming to the United States and from Canada, especially politicians, things like this, coming down here to get various types of services that they have wait lists there. Better results. One of the things that I teach in the MBA healthcare program here, and so I'm forced to read a lot of these studies. And one of the things I kind of see is a lot of studies that try to rank countries. Unfortunately, some of the mixture of maybe some of the biases of some of the researchers flow in. One of the things I see is frequently each country is allowed to set its own definition of the variables. So like what's infant mortality, they might have different definitions of that. One thing that I come across a lot of studies that try to rank about different outcomes and so forth is they'll say, they'll take a variable, they'll call it access, and what it really is, do you have socialized medicine? And so it becomes a dummy variable. It's either 100% rating for that variable or 0. And so that's one of the things. But one thing I guess I'd say is and it's, other countries, let me put it this way. Other countries have better results in a lot of ways. And the characteristics of the countries that have better results in the United States are smaller, affluent, and homogeneous. And just talking to my general GP a while ago, it's just talking about if you're in the metro area here, and someone comes in, 5 patients come in with the same sort of set of symptoms. I feel a little bit flushed, a little bit of fever, a little bit upset stomach, so forth. They say, well, if it was someone like me, someone of Norwegian ancestry, you guys have a tendency of being light sensitive, so maybe that's the issue. An African-American gentleman can come in and say, well, this could be the precursors of sickle cell anemia, the same symptoms. You go to someone else, well, you have a tendency for, genetically for, lactose intolerance and so forth. So the diagnostic piece is a bigger thing here in the United States. I mean, if you go to Japan, everybody's the same, everybody has the same diet. It really gives you better outcomes because they actually have better diets and stuff like that we do. Whereas we have people with all kinds of different diets, all kinds of different backgrounds. A lot of people like me, obviously, who aren't taking very good care of themselves. And that makes the outcomes less, better. So is it the healthcare system or is the demographics and so forth? So that kind of is, but yes, there are some countries that have better outcomes than us, but I guess we have to be careful. Is it the definition of how the variables are done in the study? And secondly, is it the culture and the characteristics of that country that are more responsible than us. I'd hate to have a policy that said no one can be fat, because I'd have to go on a diet right now. But
yeah, I think on the quality versus access issue, I think in the United States we have some of the greatest, if not the greatest, quality issues in the country, as long as you have access, in the sense of you have health insurance that gives you access. I think in that case, with the access, by having health insurance, I think one of the great things in our system is that we really do kind of financialize it and really encourage a really robust kind of system that takes risks, tries new things. But that's only true if you have health insurance. For those individuals, which is a huge percentage of the United States, they don't have access to that. So what does that mean? Well, under the federal law, hospitals are still required to treat these individuals. So let's say you get sick, you have an emergency, but you don't have access to health insurance. So you go down to Hannibal County Medical Center, you go down to the very finest healthcare center you can find, and they're required to treat you. But that's it. Now, the level of that treatment is always going to be the question as to how long, how much, because every dollar that the hospital is putting out, they're doing the cost estimate saying, I'm not going to get this paid back, I'm not going to get reimbursed this is going to end up being charitable care, and I can only do so much of that because I'm going to pass on that cost to other individuals, usually people who have health insurance. So when you see people losing access to Medicaid, access to affordable health care through the government, it actually impacts people who also pay insurance, because as much as I think the hospitals are really kind and great people, I don't think they're going to absorb all of our country's charitable care. They're going to pass on those costs to individuals who are payers, have health insurance, and those people who have access to health insurance. So I think that is something to keep in mind when you see those numbers. It's not just about the people who are poor. The reality is these individuals are still going to come to the hospital, they're still going to get treatment, and the costs that are associated with that are going to be passed on to somebody else, and usually that is to paying customers.
Next question. Another theme that came through your cards was, I think, concern about the debt and the spending. You said $20 trillion. And I think combining a few of these questions to say, with your inverted tree analogy, aren't we going to run out of money? But in the short term, the largest voting demographic and the biggest block of people are the seniors, the pig and the python. So how do you convince people who are benefiting the most and voting the most to maybe vote in what's not in their best interest? Is that a fair way to phrase the question?
I didn't know I had to provide answers. No, no, seriously, that is the big thing. And I had one of my slides. I can't remember the quote, so I really shouldn't have included it. But if I can't give the original source, but some smart aleck said something, that which can't go on forever won't. So the role of government will be getting smaller in our lives, maybe not in our lives, but the next generation. It just might not be by choice. And you kind of see this when you go to various communities that have set up entitlement programs, say defined benefit retirement plans for their municipal employees that wound up outstripping the tax base. And what you see in some of those communities are things, well, we're going to do less welfare spending for poor people, or we're going to let our infrastructure start declining and things like this. Yeah, it's one of those things. We do have some leeway and I'm being a little bit of an optimist here. It's going to sound like a very morbid optimism, but I think we'll be able to solve things after enough of us baby boomers die. Just being very, very harsh about this. Part of that is we have a little bit of leeway here because still, for the time being, the US dollar is the reserve currency. Whether we might not believe it, even after the financial crisis, the United States government is the most perfect entity on the planet to still loan your money to. When you buy your T-bill and it comes due, they can raise taxes on someone else to pay you. If that's not enough, they can borrow from someone else to pay you. And last resort, they actually own the copying machine to actually print the money for you, which means we'll pay for it through inflation at some point. And we have to say, well, is that the cost we're willing to dump on the next generation? Is we'll pay off the debt, but you guys will just be living with hyperinflation. Some hard choice. Well, as I said, I think there is some leeway. We have some time, as I said, because the dollar is still considered the U.S. reserve, or the world's reserve currency. So a lot of people in other countries are still willing to buy our government securities and finance that. But a little trick question here. It's the old lunning to ourselves argument. I don't know. Who do you think is the largest holder of U.S. Government securities in the world? No, China's not even close. The U.S. banking system. So basically, and it's also kind of the reason why the money supply has been increased and we haven't had inflation is basically, the federal government issues government securities, and our banking system buys them and does that instead of making loans and things like this. So it's a way to, so we actually been self-absorbing our own debt through our financial system. I don't know if I can go on forever, but I think we have some time here. But as I said, seriously, once the pig starts getting smaller and smaller as it gets digested, we will have a window to start straightening things up.
So it took all I had not to increase. Usually whenever I do a presentation, I have like 5 slides on the national deficit and spending and social programs. It took all I had not to include it because I probably would have gone way too long than I already did. The reality is when you look at the federal deficit and where the money is, a lot of the money is in entitlement programs. It's in the Medicare, it's in Social Security, it's in Medicaid. Every year you hear the government talk about, here we have the deficit, we have to do the annualized appropriations bill. The annualized budget of the federal government, because only deals with non-entitlement programs. So every single year, those programs are not included. So when you see in December 8th, you'll hear the discussion again about shutting down the government and funding the government, that's what we're talking about. And the reality is in that pot of money, it is about $1 billion, give or take, in programming. But we have a $500 to $600 billion deficit, which that means is you could eliminate all discretionary social service programs, Department of Education, Labor, Environment, Energy, HHS, eliminate them all, and we still have a $100 billion deficit. So what does that mean? We have to talk about entitlements, but I think we have to talk about entitlements in a balanced and reasonable way. And one of the great challenges we see right now is, obviously they're in the midst of a tax reform discussion, which is projected to add another $1.5 trillion over 10 years to the deficit. So unless the promised economic growth comes back to repay that $1.5 trillion, plus the additional annualized $500 billion, we're going to only fall further and further behind, which only is going to put greater pressure on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid programs, and social services programs. So the long-term reality is, unless those reforms come through, we're looking at long-term costs. We're going to have even greater impetus on the pig to make dramatic changes. And I think that's where I think people need to realize that this isn't right now. This is also long-term, that entitlement reform can be done in a balanced way. One of the things, last point, people don't know, there was actually another health care bill that came out, bipartisan, by Senator Alexander, Senator Murray. The Congressional Budget Office scored it and found that it covered more people and saved the government money. And what was the response from the political leaders? This is a non-starter. So what is that? So that idea of access to quality affordability, I think part of this divisiveness is really unhealthy because we've got to have honest discussions about getting there. And that requires talking about revenue. It requires talking about spending in an honest way about how we do things.
Unfortunately, I do have to close the program now. There are so many good questions in our weapon here. This topic is obviously so much bigger than just an hour's worth of conversations. But I think that all of you will agree that we know more about it now than we did an hour ago, and that it'll be helpful in continuing the conversation in every one of the venues in which we continue it. So please join me in thanking our moderator and our